Well, my leg fell asleep sitting there listening to the meeting, so I don't know how this is going to go. We're going to be in 2 Samuel tonight. We're going to finish up chapter 13, Lord willing, and we started it last week, and we're going to catch the end of it. We had a message that it was entitled Reaping the Whirlwind, and so now we're reaping the whirlwind part 2. Just to remind you where we are in the flow of the story, King David, a man after God's own heart, sinned. And his sin was horrendous, but the consequences have been devastating. And because of David's sin, he's now sown the wind, but he's reaping the whirlwind. We saw last week one of the most horrific stories in the Bible. Again, this is 2 Samuel chapter 13. We saw that his own daughter was raped. And if I were to just tell you the story and say, well, what if you had a king who was very, very powerful, whose little girl got used and abused in that way? What do you think would happen to the perpetrator who did it? So that's where your mind probably should be thinking about this, but it doesn't go the way you would think. In large part because David's son is the one who did it. So this was his half-sister that he took advantage of. And so to pick up where the story was left off last week, let's just look at verse 21. I know we read it last week, but just as a reminder, and then we'll read through the text, and I'll just give you a few more thoughts about the consequences of sin that come. Here's what it says. Now, when King David heard of all these matters, he was very angry. Cut my light on here. That'll help me a little bit since I'm getting old. But the Bible says, but Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Now it came about after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. Now you've seen something like this before. It was in 1 Samuel 25, but there was a man by the name of Nabal who had a wife named Abigail. King David was guarding the sheep of Nabal, and there came time to shear the sheep. And when that happens back in this day, if you're one that owns a lot of sheep, you're going to be very rich, and you're going to throw a big party. It's time to celebrate. It's almost like the companies in our day and time who maybe around New Year's or maybe between Christmas and New Year's might throw a big party. I've known of one company that it was a smaller company, but at the end of the year, after working hard all year, they put everybody that worked for them on a cruise. It was all expenses paid, and you just went and had a good time for a whole week. This is kind of what's happening here. Big festival, big celebration, sheep shearing time. Absalom, one of the sons of David, has a lot of sheep, and he's throwing a party. And about verse 24 says, Absalom came to the king and said, behold now, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. But the king said to Absalom, no, my son, we should not all go, for we will be burdensome to you. So Absalom is actually putting a plan in place to do some damage. And he's got a gambit here, and he's rolling the dice on it. And he's wagering, in a sense, that if he invites his daddy to come, his daddy's not going to come. You can imagine what it would be like if the king had to show up in another town, the posse, the guards, the army that would have to accompany him. Think about if the President of the United States went somewhere right now and all the Secret Service that would go with them, and his son Absalom would have had to have taken care of all these. And so David says, if I go, I'll be a burden to you because you'll have to take care of all of us. So he says, I'm not going to go. He says, although he urged him, he would not go, but blessed him. Have my blessing, son. Then Absalom said, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with me. Now, this is his half-brother, the one who raped his full-blooded sister. Let Amnon go. Remember that Amnon is the firstborn son of David. So he is the heir to the throne. He is the next in line to become king, even though he is a reprobate. And if the king can't go, who do you send in his place? The one you would try to get would be the next in line to the throne. So here's the scheme. Let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? So maybe he feels like something's fishy, something's up, but he can't quite figure it out. But when Absalom urged him, he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. So everybody gets to go now. Absalom commanded his servant, saying, see now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then put him to death. Do not fear, have not I myself commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. The servants of Absalom did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. Now it was while they were on the way that the report came to David, saying, Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. So bad news travels fast. How in the world news got back that quick, who knows, because all these guys are on mules, and if you were really rich back in that day, that's what you rode on, was a mule. So these are king's sons, and they're fleeing, but word gets back, but it's gossip, and it's lies. Have you ever known someone who says something that they think is true, might be true, but they say it as if it is fact, when it's just their guessing? And they make it like they know something when in fact they really don't. That's what's happening here. You see a lot of gossip, don't you? People saying something that they claim is a fact or it's true, and it's not. It's also sinful. It's not the main point of the message, but I'm just going to point this out because it happens a lot. It happens to me. I hear people talk about me some, and it happens to you too probably. People talk about you, and they say something like it's a fact, and they don't talk to you or ask you about it, but it goes on. The gossip was spreading. It says, then the king arose and tore his clothes and lay on the ground, and all his servants were standing by with their clothes torn. Now, I'm sure as the king, and when you rip your garments, what is that? That's an outward sign of what's going on inside. You've just heard that every son of yours has died, been murdered by one of your sons. Your only son that's left is a murderer of all the others. That's what he thinks has happened. And probably in his mind, he is going back to the prophecy that Nathan gave him back in, it was chapter 12, where God said to him in verse 10, the sword shall never depart out of your house because you have despised me and taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. God told him, you're in for a world of trouble. There's a lot of hurt coming your way, buddy. You should have never done what you did with that woman. You should have never murdered her husband to cover it up. And now you've sown the wind. You're about to reap the whirlwind, and he gets word, every one of my boys is dead. So you rip your garments. He's laying on the ground. I could just see him grabbing his stomach, turned over, laying in a fetal position. I'm sure it's horrifically painful. Jonadab, you remember him maybe. He was the troublemaker back in verse 3 that helped Amnon come up with the plan that led to the raping of his sister. He is one that is an opportunist. He looks to weasel his way in with people and try to get in with them, people that are in power. And he speaks, and it says the son of Shimei, David's brother, responded. So this is King David's nephew, and he's there in the court. He says, do not let my lord suppose that they have put to death all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. Because by the intent of Absalom, this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar. Now therefore, do not let my lord the king take the report to heart, namely, all the king's sons are dead, for only Absalom is dead. And it makes you wonder, how did he know that, and how did he figure all that out? Certainly he knew more than he had ever let on to before, but he's given the king hope in a hopeless situation. Now Absalom had fled, And the young man who was the watchman raised his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. Jonadab said to the king, behold, the king's sons have come, according to your servant's word. So it happened. As soon as he finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted their voices and wept. And also the king and all his servants wept very bitterly. Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. I remember David is married to that king's daughter. He's a Gentile. He's a pagan. Daughter probably is too. But Absalom is the son of a princess. Son of the king, and his mother is a princess of another kingdom. So he's got royalty on both sides. So he flees back to Mama's home country is what he's done, which is, if you have a map in your mind and you can picture it, it's up maybe about 2 or 3 o'clock. If you think about that, if you think about the Sea of Galilee, that part of the Sea of Galilee, maybe 2 o'clock on up toward Syria to the north. So that's kind of their area up there. And it says, and David mourned his son every day. That means every day for the rest of his life, he thought about his boy. So Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur, and was there 3 years. The heart of King David longed to go out to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, since he was dead. Time passed, and things got easier. A few thoughts about reaping the whirlwind here, and even about sin and the consequences of sin. And one of the things that sin very often demands is justice. In other words, when people do horrific things, they need to be brought to be held accountable for what they've done. And, there's that phrase that we throw around, justice is blind, and sometimes we'd like to think that it is, but we also know that sometimes people get preferential treatment, don't we? Well, David has a child, a little girl, that has something horrific happen to her. He's the king. He's like the Supreme Court. He's basically the chief justice, and all the other justices rolled into one. He's got lots of power, but he does nothing. You saw back in verse 21 what it said. David heard of all these matters. He was angry, but you don't hear that he did anything else, do you? He just got mad about it, but he never acted. He never brought his son to account for the crime that he had committed. It is right to punish wrongdoing. You're supposed to. And you probably think in your mind right now, it was wrong for David, even if that was his son, not to do something about it. If someone had done something like that to you, you would want them brought to justice. So when we think about the idea that sin, often when it becomes criminal or harmful, demands justice, and how every single act, if justice was served, would bring about a judgment against it and a punishment, our minds really should go to think about, in a spiritual sense, if we want a spiritual lesson from this, how every one of us have sinned against God. And in doing so, we are lawbreakers. And if we can think about what would it be like if someone sinned against me and committed something horrendous and harmful to me, and the judge that was in charge and the person that had the power that could do something about it to punish the one that did it, did nothing. Maybe got a little angry about it, but never acted. You would say, and you'd be right, you would say what? You'd say, that's wrong. That's not right. And so when we wonder sometimes why God judges sin, why God punishes sinners, why does God do that? Why do we have a jail cell called hell where ongoing punishment for all of eternity takes place? It's because crimes need to be punished. Criminals need to be brought to account. And because we're all sinners, the truth is, when we stand before God on Judgment Day, we will all be found guilty. Every one of us has thought bad thoughts. We've said bad words. We've done bad things. That's why we need Jesus. On the cross, Jesus is held accountable for my sin. Jesus, who never sinned, hangs in my place. The wages of sin against me is death. I not only deserve a physical death, but there is also an eternal death. Jesus on the cross cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? All the sin of mankind comes upon him. He is physically, emotionally, spiritually, he's going through it. There's a crown of thorns on his head. There are nails in his hands and feet. A whip has been upon his back that now rises up and down against this nasty wooden post that he's hanging upon. He is tortured to death, hung there to die because I am a sinner, because we're all sinners. The one who never sinned was punished for sin. And now when we think about sin, here's what we know. Although every one of us is guilty, some will put their faith in Christ alone, in his work on the cross alone, for the forgiveness of sin, the payment for our debt, for the washing away through his blood, for the redemption of sin. And we can in faith do this because Jesus is alive, and that proves he is the Son of God, and your faith will be found to be very wise on Judgment Day. Because on Judgment Day, although we would be found guilty, we could say, but my debt has been paid in full. Jesus paid it all. He paid the price. And those who would say, I don't come to God through faith in Jesus, I try to work my way to heaven, I try to earn my salvation, or I try to be a good person, would found still to be guilty for the things that they have done and need to be punished. Your faith has got to be in Christ alone. You have to come to God through faith alone. It's by grace alone. We don't earn it. It's a gift that we receive freely. And so we come to God knowing that every sin will be punished. My sin is either going to be punished in Jesus on a cross, or I'd have to stand before God and answer for it for all of eternity. But no one gets away with anything, small or great. All sin in the end gets punished by a just and holy God. God would not be fair, it would not be right, it would not be good of God just to wink at sin, act like it's no big deal, and let it go. David did not do what he should have done. He should have acted, but he didn't. And you know, part of punishment and justice, at least in this world, in this life, involves a sense of deterrence, doesn't it? Because when you punish someone for a crime, what you're saying to others who would consider doing the same thing is, you can expect the same fate if you do what they did. And when people see and they hear and they know that there's pain that's going to come their way because of bad things that they do, very often they may want to do the bad things, but because they don't want the pain, they won't do them. It protects everyone else, as well as giving some sort of sense of satisfaction, at least in some way, to the victims of crime. Justice is important and it matters. And so this makes me wonder, as I think about what went on here, I wonder if Absalom looked at his father, the king who should have done something and didn't. And as he said, you know, my brother got away with it. There was never a thing done to him. I wonder if he scratched his head and said, well, I wonder if I can get away with something now. Because he's going to commit murder. He's going to kill his own half-brother. And then he's going to run and just think, Daddy won't do anything to me about it. And by the way, he was right. It matters that justice takes place and that justice is fair and right. Another thing about the consequences of sin, and we see that sin demands justice, but just another thing about it real quick from verse 22. Sin can very often, it can spawn into different sin, can it? In other words, it starts in one place. Here you have a rape. You have this terrible crime that's been committed, as well as a sin against God himself. But now, if you look at what it says in verse 22, Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad. You ever had somebody that didn't like you and they wouldn't talk to you? You ever had somebody give you the silent treatment? You just don't say a word? Well, that's what Absalom's doing. He won't talk to him. And the Bible goes on, it says, Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. And so the sin, now there's more sin that's been brought up and brought out. Because now Absalom has hatred in his heart. And you remember Jesus warned, and he said things like this: if you lust after a woman in your heart, you've committed adultery with her. And he says something else. He says, if you hate someone in your heart, it's as if you've committed murder. And you can think along these lines, well, if someone hates someone that bad and has the opportunity to kill them and thinks they can get away with it, are they going to act on it? Well, that's a big part of it, isn't it? And so you see that there's a desire here for vengeance based on what we've read here, that there's a desire to inflict harm or injury or even humiliation to somebody that's done the same thing to somebody else. Now, speaking along those lines, God doesn't give individuals the right to take vengeance. In the Bible, we are told that government is supposed to be in charge of this, because very often when people get like this and there's hatred in their heart, they go beyond what they should. The Bible is, from the very early on stages, setting the standard that you're not supposed to go beyond what's happened. So it says things like this: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Somebody knocks out your tooth, you might want to knock out 10 of their teeth, but you can only knock out one. You get in a fight and somebody hits you and knocks out your eye. You can't knock out both of theirs as much as you might want to. The standard is it's an eye for an eye, not two eyes for one eye. And so what that does is that kind of regulates things. And you start to understand that you don't, commit petty theft and spend the rest of your life in prison. That would be unjust, unfair, and it would be cruel. You'd make them pay for the crime and it would be over. Well, the same thing here is going on. Absalom has known that his brother's done something very bad, but it's going to cost him his life. And it goes too far, and it's not right. But that's the way it's going to end up working out. Sin often, it demands justice, but it often, if it's not brought to bear, at least in your own heart, it can turn into something greater, and it can fester and become way worse through the expanding and other things like that into other sins. I'll just give you one more thought about this and we'll be done because we're out of time. I really probably don't have to go into this a whole lot. I hit on a little bit of it last week, but David's two crimes were, one was murder and the other one was illicit sexual activity. But it's now been reproduced in both of his sons. And we talked last week about how very often our sins affect our children. And there are no perfect parents. There aren't. And so I know that I've messed mine up, and I know my parents have messed me up. I mean, it's just the way of it. And maybe you're a perfect parent and you've not done that, but and maybe your parents were perfect and you don't want to think like that. But it's very often the case that a lot of things are impressed upon us, and it would seem natural that would happen because, we spend a lot of time with our family. We look to our parents as authorities, and that we come in very close contact with them, and so we've got to be careful with that. So one of the things I do know is this, though, at least I believe it to be true. And everybody in here's had a parent probably. You may have been an orphan. Somebody cared for you, though, if that was the case. So let me just say this. And I'll just end with this thought and won't go into the long thing that I had here. Very often the parents that know they messed up, they've got regrets. And you may have been hurt by your parents in some way, and you may have memories of that pain. And it may be that your parents never said, "I'm sorry for what they did." Maybe they were verbally abusive. Maybe they were distant and uncaring and unloving and unfeeling. And who knows? It can happen 1,000 different ways, can it? If one ever does come to you and say, "I'm sorry, I messed up in a lot of ways, and I wish it could have been different. Let that person apologize and have grace and love as you respond to it without being bitter and angry. Just receive it. That's your mom or your daddy. You may want to one day do that to your children and think about what it would be like to speak to your children that way. Say, there's a lot of things I wish I would have done different. But, something else is that instead of thinking about the bad, you can think about the good. Because while we've all had bad things that have happened and things we wish would have been different, there's a whole lot of good maybe that came your way because of your parents. And the thing to do is to learn from the bad and say, well, I see what the consequences of some things they did were. I know not to go down that road. Or to say, I don't want to do that with my children. Or to, you got to learn from it. If you don't learn from it, it's a waste. But you got to learn from mistakes and failures and things like that. That's how you grow. But concentrate on the good and think about the good, because there's probably a whole lot more good than was bad. At least I hope there was to you. But be careful, because what you do can affect children. And it can have a powerful impact on their life. You saw it with David, how he impacted his children. I looked up a song today, and I bet you know it. It's an old hymn from 1974. Let me see if you pick up the words from it. My child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way, but there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away. He was talking before I knew it, and as he grew, he'd say, I'm going to be like you, Dad. I know I'm going to be like you. But the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you coming home, Dad? Don't know when. We'll get together then. You know that song? You know how it ends? He says over and over again, I'm going to be like you, Dad. I'm going to be like you, Dad. Here's the thing. Even a lost world knows that parents have a profound impact on how their children are once they grow up. And so when you see things that have been things that maybe are regretful and rueful from maybe your upbringing, it's time to break the cycle. If there's sin, it's time to stop it and make sure that is broken and it doesn't continue on with the next one. Here is how the song ends. I've since retired. My son's moved away. I called him up the other day. He said, I'd like to see you if you don't mind. I'd love to see you too, Dad, if I can find the time. You see, my new job's a hassle. The kids had the flu. It's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's sure nice talking to you. And as I hung up the phone, it occurred to me, he'd grown up just like me. My boy was just like me. And it started when the cat was in the cradle. Let's work to make sure that we raise our children to understand the consequences of sin. Make sure when we mess up, we fess up. Sometimes we might need to speak to them and say, look, Daddy, Mama, we did wrong, and I'm sorry. And let's try to break that cycle. And if we don't know Jesus, make sure you turn to him by faith and trust him today. Father, in Jesus' name, thank you.